All right, so far we've been focused on measurement and on significant figures, and we've kind of mentioned units, meaning grams, meters, etc. Um, but we do want to focus on that a little bit because we're also going to be able to talk about converting between them. So things like pounds to kilograms and liters to milliliters, things like that are very important throughout the year. So let's go ahead and begin. The first thing we need to know is what the System International Base Units are, or SI base units are for chemistry. A couple that we have to think about here: the meter, of course, symbolized there by an M, abbreviated by an M. Time, the base unit for time is seconds. Technically, the SI base unit for mass is kilograms, but I don't really like that this is the only one that has a prefix. So we're just going to say that the base unit for mass is grams. And I put a paper clip there because typical paper clip is about a gram, just to give you some perspective. Amount of a substance, and we'll talk more about what this really means later on, but amount of a substance in chemistry is measured in moles, which is abbreviated MOL. And then, keep moving myself around here, we have volume, and technically volume is not an SI unit because it's derived. It's going to be cubic meters or liters, which is equal to a cubic decimeter, or 0.1 meters on a side, 0.1 meters cubed. So I put it in red there because it's technically not an SI base unit, but we kind of treat it as though it is. And then energy, which is measured in joules. We'll talk more about that later on. Okay, so the other main thing we need to do today is learn how to convert between units or change between units. So let me give you an example, and you're going to want to write this down. So how many kilometers are equal to 12 miles? So the typical student is going to see a question like this and do this, right? Google how many kilometers are 12 miles. Or maybe somebody a little bit more interested in sort of like working the problem out might just Google, how many kilometers are equal to 1 mile and find a conversion like this. I want to get a little bit more systematic about it though, because, while we can Google things often, and we almost always have our phones at the ready, or computers, there is a point to learning a method of unit converting that is more systematic and more reliable than simply looking something up. And quicker, honestly, once we get into some more complex problems. Okay, so let's say we want to take this 12 miles, okay, and we want to convert that into kilometers. The way I would start it off is I would go ahead and write it as a fraction. Now, you don't really have to do this part because, of course, anything over 1, you can put anything over 1 and it becomes a fraction. But I like the way that it works out because what we're going to be doing with this fraction is multiplying it by another fraction, okay, to do a conversion. Now, when we multiply fractions, we divide top by bottom, right? When we're done, multiply across top, multiply across the bottom, and then divide to get our final, decimal answer. And so what I'm going to do is I'm trying to get rid of miles, and I'm trying to convert it into kilometers because that's what the original question said. How many kilometers are equal to 12 miles? So if I want to get rid of miles, that means I'm going to have to put that unit miles on the bottom of my next fraction so that when I divide miles by miles, it cancels. And by that same logic, that would mean that I would want to put kilometers on top so that it doesn't cancel and it's left over in my answer. All right, so then the next question is, what's the relationship between miles and kilometers? And that's where, you could look it up. And in this case, it's 1 mile is equal to 1.60934 kilometers. All right, and so what we do is we simply put the number next to the unit. So 1 goes next to miles, and this big long number goes next to kilometers, 1.60934, and a 1 next to miles, okay? And that's it. So I would cancel miles because it shows up on top and bottom. And so if I divide miles by miles, it goes to 1. and I would be left with kilometers in my answer. And so I'm ready to plug it in the calculator. So 12 times 1.60934 divided by the product of 1 times 1, which of course is just 1. And so really it's just 12 times 1.60934. And I get an answer like this. And of course, again, my unit is kilometers because miles are already canceled. Okay. Now the last step, of course, is sig figs. None of this stuff in the middle here, the conversion factor, matters when it comes to sig figs because that's a constant. We didn't measure it. It's not variable. The 12 miles, of course, that could have been any distance. It could have been 12.2 miles. It could have been, any number. Miles is, of course, a variable number, and it's a measurement. It changes. So I do need to look at that for sig figs. So I really, in these conversions, I really only have one number that I have to look at for sig figs and just match my answer to that number of sig figs. So 12 miles has, of course, 2 sig figs. So 19.3121 kilometers should become 19 kilometers, and that's my answer. Okay, so 2 sig figs is my final answer. All right, let's try one more. Let's try converting 85 kilometers per hour into miles per hour. Okay, now this one is a little bit more complex because it's a compound unit, kilometers per hour and then miles per hour. But we only have to convert one of those things. We don't have to convert the hours because we want it to be hours in the end. So all we're really changing is kilometers to miles, which we just did the opposite of in the last problem. So the first hint on a compound unit like this, where I have 85 kilometers per hour, is I want you to think of that as 85 kilometers per 1 hour and write it as a fraction again. The difference being this time, I have a unit in the bottom. Instead of just putting a number over 1 like I did in the previous problem, I actually have a unit there, okay? So the next step is going to be, we have to convert, right? So we're going to draw a little fraction bar, and we are going to convert, not hours, hours can stay put. We just need to convert this kilometers into miles. So if kilometers needs to be taken away, needs to be canceled, of course it needs to go on the bottom, right? And then miles is what we want, so it goes on the top. And so once again, the reason I did that is because dividing kilometers by kilometers cancels kilometers and leaves me with miles on top and hours on the bottom, okay? We could also be converting kilometers per hour into like miles per second or meters per second or something like that. So we could convert both distance and time, but we're not doing it in this problem. We'll get to that later. All right, so the next step is to fill in our numbers here, our relationship. And we already had that relationship in the previous problem. And so I'll show you, don't write this down because you already did. This was the previous problem. Notice the 1.60934 went on top. Well, this time it's going to go on the bottom, and the reason for that is the 1.60934 goes next to kilometers. It doesn't matter whether it goes on top or bottom. That's going to vary depending on the problem. What matters is that number goes next to kilometers, and a 1 will go next to miles. Okay? So in this case, I'm going to end up dividing by 1.60934 because I'm going from kilometers to miles, whereas last time I was going in the opposite direction. And I don't have to do anything else because I've got miles on top, I've got hours on bottom, and that's what the problem is asking me for, find the answer in miles per hour. And so now I'm going to take 85 and divide it by 1.60934, right? Because the 1.60934 is on bottom. I mean, technically, I'm multiplying both numbers by 1 and then dividing, but of course, that doesn't make any difference. And so I get this answer, and then the last step is to worry about sig figs. And it looks like, again, go back to your starting number. In this case, it has 2 sig figs. So my answer becomes 53 miles per hour. That is all. We'll do some more problems in class.